At 14, Elijah Foster knew better than to get comfortable. The sterile bedrooms with mismatched sheets, the reluctant smiles of new foster parents, and the scrutiny of other children. It was a cycle he had come to expect. Home was not a place, but a stopover, a temporary shelter where people weighed him with their eyes, quietly deciding whether he was too much trouble to keep. He had been in the system since he was 5. The reasons were muddled in his memory, shadows of loud arguments, nights with no food, and finally strangers in uniforms taking him away. Since then, Elijah had lived in 11 foster homes. Each one had its own smells, its own rules, and its own walls that didn't remember his name long after he was gone. His latest placement, a weather-beaten house near the edge of Fairpoint County, lasted just under 6 months. The family claimed they were overwhelmed. Truthfully, they had never been interested in him, not really. They wanted a younger child, someone who didn't stutter when he spoke, someone who could charm guests and say grace at dinner without trembling. Elijah's stutter had always been his enemy, words bottlenecked in his throat, clumsy and jagged, each syllable a struggle. At school, other kids imitated him cruelly, turning his pauses into punchlines. Teachers, though more patient, often finished his sentences for him, which hurt in its own way. He learned that silence was safer. But in his silence, he continues to use his powerful gift of writing. One autumn afternoon in the back corner of the school library, he discovered an old leather journal left behind on a windowsill. No one claimed it, so Elijah did. He began to write, not about heroes or dragons, but about the things he couldn't say out loud. The paper didn't mock his stutter. It let him speak clearly, perfectly. His pen bled feelings he couldn't otherwise release. Pain, confusion, the aching loneliness that sat like a weight on his chest. He named the journal Pine. It was inspired by the small wooded area near his newest temporary home, a grove of tall pine trees where Elijah often went to be alone. He liked the sound the wind made there, whispering through the needles, soft and unjudging. In the pines, no one laughed at his speech, and the quiet didn't feel oppressive. It felt holy. Elijah's stories in Pine weren't all sad. He imagined boys like him becoming adventurers, wordsmiths, leaders of forgotten kingdoms. He wrote poetry too, shy stanzas about stars and storms and the way the world looked at dusk. It was his secret, his solace. The only person who knew about Pine was Miss Trina. Miss Trina was in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a voice like velvet. Most caseworkers came and went, ticking boxes and making shallow calls, but Miss Trina continued to remain constant in his life. Through broken placements, school meetings, and late-night anxiety attacks, she was there. When foster parents gave up on him, she didn't. She bought him sketchbooks and notebooks, always encouraging his writing, even when he was too ashamed to share it. Elijah, Miss Trina once said, kneeling in front of him after yet another failed placement, "You are not broken. The world just hasn't figured out how to listen to you yet." He cried that day alone in solitude, not because of the pain, but because Trina was the only one who said anything beautiful about him. At 15, Elijah had reached what he quietly called his ghost year. It was a time when the world seemed to turn entirely against him, when he felt less like a boy and more like a shadow drifting between places that never wanted him. After being removed from a foster home in early spring, he was placed with a couple who outwardly appeared kind and charitable. The Millers were well off and praised in their church community for opening their home to children in need, but behind closed doors their compassion soured quickly into cruelty. They saw Elijah as a blemish, something to be fixed or disciplined into normalcy. The Millers were particularly intolerant of his speech defect. "Speak properly or don't speak at all," Mr. Miller once barked when Elijah stammered through a question at dinner. He wasn't allowed to excuse himself from the table unless he could say the sentence perfectly. The anxiety this caused made the stuttering worse. Eventually he stopped speaking altogether during meals, chewing quietly, eyes fixed on his plate. Mrs. Miller took a different approach, one that hurt more subtly. She would ridicule his writing when she found his journal. "You write like a victim," she sneered, tossing the notebook onto his bed one evening. "Maybe if you spent less time living in make-believe, someone would actually want you." The words cut deep because they echoed his own fears. Worse than the verbal cruelty was the isolation. He wasn't allowed to use the internet except for schoolwork, and any personal belongings were locked away under the guise of discipline. Even Pine, his beloved journal, was confiscated. Miss Trina found out weeks later during one of her monthly visits and demanded its return. The Millers reluctantly complied, but gave notice shortly after that Elijah wasn't fitting in. He was moved again. In the group home that followed, things were different, but not better. The staff was indifferent, overworked, and often cold. One of the older boys, Rico, singled Elijah out as a target from the start. Rico was 17, muscular, and angry at the world. He mocked Elijah's stutter relentlessly and encouraged the other boys to do the same. "Hey, speak up, ghost boy," they'd laugh. One night, Rico and two others cornered Elijah in the rec room. They didn't hit him, not that time. But they took his journal and tore out pages, throwing them into the toilet and laughing as they flushed them down. The humiliation stayed with him for weeks. That summer, Elijah began to suffer from night terrors. He would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced he was still trapped in that house with the Millers or facing Rico's sneer again. He stopped eating properly and lost weight. His grades dropped. No one noticed, except Miss Trina. She escalated the situation, filed a report against the group home for neglect, and managed to get Elijah transferred, again. By then, he had developed a habit of flinching when doors slammed or people raised their voices. His journal entries became darker. Some nights he wrote poems that danced dangerously close to thoughts of self-harm. Not because he wanted to die, but because he wanted the pain to be visible to someone, anyone. Miss Trina never left his side. She took him out to the park sometimes just to sit and talk or not talk. She encouraged him to write letters to himself, to forgive himself for the things that weren't his fault. Slowly, Elijah began to reclaim his voice, not out loud, but in ink. The strength of his imagination became a lifeline. He started writing about a character named Solace, a boy who could only speak in dreams, whose voice could heal others but never himself. In fiction, Elijah found power. In truth, he carried trauma. But he also carried hope. By the time he was 16, Elijah had stopped expecting adoption. The younger kids got families. They were easier to mold, easier to love, at least in the eyes of those seeking children to complete their homes. Elijah was too old, too quiet, too strange, too complicated. But he no longer wanted to be saved. What he wanted was to understand himself. He started entering writing contests anonymously, sending in his poems and short stories under the pseudonym E.J. Pine. One of his pieces, a haunting narrative about a boy who spoke in birdsong, won second place in a statewide competition. Miss Trina was the first to know. She screamed when she read the email and hugged him so tightly he thought his ribs might break. By 17, Elijah had a small online following. He shared his work on blogs and forums, often receiving comments from readers who said they felt seen. His stories, full of quiet hope and jagged sorrow, resonated with those who had also felt invisible. He never used his real name. He wasn't ready for that kind of attention. But through E.J. Pine, he was heard. One cold winter morning, Elijah walked alone into the pine grove near his current placement, a group home where the staff rotated too often to remember his birthday. He sat beneath the tallest tree, an opened pine, now thick with years of ink and imagination. Snow dusted the ground, and breath fog curled in the air. In that silence, he felt not alone, but whole. Later that year, Miss Trina helped him apply for a creative writing scholarship at a liberal arts college. She wrote him a glowing letter of recommendation, framing his resilience not as tragedy, but as triumph. When he received the acceptance letter, Elijah cried again. This time they were tears of disbelief and cautious joy. He never found an adoptive family, but he found himself. through the storms of his youth, through bullying, speech struggles, and abandonment. He carved a voice on paper louder than any spoken word. The world hadn't wanted to listen, but Elijah had learned how to sing anyway. And in the hush of the pines, where the wind still whispered through needles, his silence was no longer empty. It was a language of its own. But as Elijah got older, what happened when the trauma was triggered? See what happens next.